Neha, just make sense of what's going on. Cold War 2.0, US aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, Russia sending in carrier killer missile armed fighter jets into the Mediterranean. Is a replay of the Cold War going on here?
You know, it's beginning to look like that increasingly. And you know, a lot of people are saying, Sandeep, that what the Russia-Ukraine war couldn't do, the Israel-Hamas conflict is managing to achieve. By that, I think what people are essentially saying is that there is an unmistakable widening of this conflict. Right. If anybody thought that this was going to be confined to Israel just pounding Gaza and going after Hamas, it increasingly looks like it's not going to remain confined to that. Right. Now, let's look at, you know, some facts that have come to the fore in just the last few days. You've had Israeli strikes on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Right. You've had Israelis targeting certain sites in Syria. There's been an exchange of gunfire there. Iran is repeatedly issuing threats to Israel, saying, remember, our hands are on the trigger. Right. You know, you have Turkey, which is very upset with Israel. They've very publicly taken that stand. You have Russia and China, and you were just referring to Putin. You have Russia and China jumping in. Yeah. Clearly siding with the Palestinians. Right. And not just blaming Israel, but pointing a finger at the United States for what's happened and accusing it of having completely failed as far as this Middle East policy is concerned. So, you know, Neha,
the interesting thing is that the carrier strike groups, two of them incidentally, and they're the most powerful naval combat power formations in the world. There are two of them being sent in to, warn the other actors like Iran and Hezbollah to stay away. But I think President Putin seems to have pulled another one, a number on the Americans by sending in the aircraft. So how does this kind of change things, in the next couple of days?
It does look like, Putin is sending out a clear message to the United States. You know, in fact, it's very interesting. Sandeep, I just interviewed former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, and when I asked him about whether this conflict was widening, whether Syria and Lebanon and other countries could get sucked into it, Iran and the United States, because as you mentioned, the United States has sent its aircraft carrier. Biden was in Tel Aviv yesterday expressing unstinting support for Israel. He said something interesting. He said, I somehow don't see the conflict widening because all these countries would do well to remember that they don't want a war with the United States. Yes. Having said that, that may be the belief of the former Prime Minister of Israel, but the reality on the ground seems to be very different, as you just suggested, Sandeep.
In fact, Neha, let's just listen into what former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert told you. Let's listen in.
So do you think Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is losing the perception war and the political battle at home? Because many have called for his resignation for his failure to prevent the Hamas attacks, sir. And I'm talking about Israeli people who are angry with Prime Minister Netanyahu. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know that I happen not to like Netanyahu very much. I don't trust him. I don't think that he's the right person for the job. I think he has failed completely, and it's been a long time. He is the inspirator of this policy to ignore the Palestinian Authority and to build up some kind of a tacit cooperation with Hamas. He made the deal that released more than 1,000 murderers of Hamas in the exchange of one Israeli soldier. And all those murderers that he released from jail are now the leaders of Hamas and are responsible for these vicious attack against the state of Israel. So from the point of view of the Israelis, he failed in providing security for the people of Israel. He lost the trust of the people of Israel. He is not reliable in the eyes of the majority in our country, and his days are gone. It's a matter of a short time. We will have another leadership, and the mood of the state of Israel will be a lot more positive, a lot more moderate, and a lot more forthcoming in the desire to achieve the reconciliation and peace between us and the Palestinian Authority after the Hamas will be removed from Gaza.
So, a very pragmatic man, and it's very rare for a politician to, criticize a serving Prime Minister of Israel, as former Prime Minister Olmert seems to have done. So clearly, Bibi Netanyahu isn't very popular back home.
He isn't, Sandeep. In fact, there have been a series of news reports in recent days suggesting that his popularity ratings or approval ratings are at an all-time low.
Right.
We know that he runs a minority government,
Yes.
which has been on a shaky wicket for a very long time. The political turmoil at home hasn't helped.
Right.
Many also believe that he took his eye off the ball
Yes.
because he was too busy quelling those protests at home against the judicial overhaul. And as a result of that, today you have a situation where there are Israelis questioning the failure of the Netanyahu government
Yes.
to prevent these horrific Hamas terror attacks, the worst in Israeli history. And, like you said, the former Prime Minister there, who in fact does belong to the Likud parties, saying in very, very strong terms, I do not like Netanyahu, I do not trust this man.
Right.
He has completely messed up, he has failed as a Prime Minister, he failed to prevent these attacks, and he went on to say that he's not going to last very long. He runs a government of far-right elements,
Right.
they're not going to be there for very long, and soon we're going to have a far more moderate government in place. And he also actually expressed the optimism, interestingly, Sandeep, that once there is a more moderate government in Tel Aviv, and once Israel has quote-unquote wiped out Hamas, that there is actually going to be a real chance for peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That's what he told me.
And he told you that they want to rid the Palestinians of Hamas.
Exactly. He said it's not just Israel that needs to be set free from Hamas.
Right.
Palestinians themselves need to be set free from, as he put it, these monsters, because they kill their own people. They're absolutely heartless. We know that they use Palestinians as human shields. So he said the only way, I asked him actually very specifically, Sandeep, what is Israel's end game? Because that's the question that many are asking. You're pounding Gaza to rubble. You're killing hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians every day. There is now growing anger, by the way, around the world over the killings of, and whether it's a disproportionate response by Israel, right? Initially, there was a lot of sympathy for Israel. Some believe that narrative may be shifting. But then, what the former Prime Minister told me is that there is hope for peace. Our end game is to get rid of Hamas and to bring the peace process with the Palestinians back on track. But that can only happen when you have a more reasonable man like Mahmoud Abbas back in charge. He, in fact, was all praise for Mahmoud Abbas while he was critical of his own Prime Minister.
It's interesting when, they were like, they couldn't stand the sight of each other when the Palestinians were around. The PLO was around and Mahmoud Abbas. And now the same Mahmoud Abbas looks so much more, moderate and acceptable when you're faced with someone like Hamas. But my question is, Neha, if you wipe out Hamas, which they hell-bent on doing, Israel, what comes after that? Would there be like a Hamas 2.0, exactly like when you got rid of Al-Qaeda, ISIS sprang up. Is there a possibility that after Hamas you could be looking at a far worse kind of Hamas 2.0 or a PLO 3.0 or what have you?
That can never be ruled out. If you look at, the history of these terror organizations that you just mentioned, the Israelis now go on saying that Hamas are worse than ISIS and worse than Al-Qaeda. But look how they sprang up, right? And another very interesting point that he made in this context, I asked him, Sandeep, Ehud Olmert, I said, you're pounding Gaza every day and a lot of innocent civilians are losing their lives. But isn't it true that a lot of the Hamas leadership and the masterminds of the terror attacks on Israel are sitting pretty far away in the luxury and safety of Qatar?
They're so far away from
and he had
conflict.
an interesting answer to that. He says, if history tells you anything, it is this. Israel knows how to get its enemies regardless of where they are. And I think he dropped a huge hint there, if you ask me, Sandeep. He obviously didn't want to go into any of those operational details, but he says, I can assure you, regardless of whether they're in Gaza or elsewhere, because my question pointedly was about Qatar. He said, history will tell you we know how to get our enemies. But again, question does remain, can there be any path forward for peace. He says once we've got rid of Hamas, there will be peace talks and negotiations.
Right.
But is it going to be as simple as he makes it sound?
It doesn't seem like, and from what you mentioned, Neha, it's very clearly he's pointing at a Munich, post-Munich kind of scenario where they went around, assassinating all the masterminds, all the PLO people who planned that horrific massacre. And in this case, for instance, you're looking at one of the worst terror attacks probably in the 21st century.
Yes.
The barbarity of the attacks, targeting, men, women and children, especially the aged, and that horrifying as it is,